Hi, people. This is Lowkey. Welcome to Bradford Literature Festival, coming to you virtually. Today, we have a very, very special interview. One of the first two Muslim Congresswomen elected in the United States, the first Somali-American elected to the Congress in the United States. Today, it is my honor to be speaking directly to Ilhan Omar. It's great to have you with us today. I wanted to start by saying I really enjoyed your book. It was a journey which I think many people will be able to relate to. And we're going to get into some of the details of the book and the way that it relates to your political career. But first off, I wanted to start by asking, in the midst of an economic collapse and possibly the biggest public health failure in the history of the United States, how are you?
Well, thank you so much for asking that. I am doing well. I'm quarantined with my three children and my family and my husband. It's been really, I think, difficult to be separated from my external family, to be separated from my chosen family, my constituents, and to not have the in-face interactions with people. But as I've told my children, we are truly um, in challenging times, but there are opportunities that often come out of challenges. And few of the opportunities we're now seeing is that we're finding creative ways to connect. There are people who used to have challenges in interacting physically with folks. They might have had limitations, who are now really enjoying the fact that everybody has found a way to innovatively
Mm.
stay at home, and while we physically distance, to be socially connected. Another opportunity is that there are many of these policies that we've been advocating for, things like economic justice, social awareness for the kind of systematic injustices that exist within our country, environmental injustice, the crisis within our healthcare, and this pandemic has laid all of that bare, and it's giving us an opportunity to really propose possible solutions to these problems. And I think it is often um, that in challenging times, it can be exciting to explore new opportunities.
Yeah, for sure.
How are you
Um,
doing? How are things in London? How
well,
are things with you?
I think that we have commonalities in the ways that our governments have dealt with this situation. We have commonalities in the inequality of victims in terms of where the cost for these policies is distributed. Of
Mhm,
course, it is not the
mhm.
great leveler that some are purporting it to be.
Right.
But what I wanted, we can touch on that a little bit later on. But one question that I wanted to ask you about your book. Um, and I wanted to bring together two chapters. So there's the chapter The Fighter, and there's the chapter of, as in your words, early midlife crisis. Um, Now, to me, what those two chapters are talking about, though it is not explicitly stated in the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, is about trauma and childhood trauma and the way it manifests in adulthood. Now, on one hand, I feel that in the book, your traumatic experiences, obviously from losing your mother, from moving from your family home to uh, being a refugee, to coming to the United States, to dealing with many, many challenges throughout your life. Um, in one sense, it gives you a thicker skin when getting into politics. So, in that sense, one could say that the trauma is a form of a gift to some extent. However, the way in which trauma, I think, also acts as a curse, and I think to some extent that is displayed in the early midlife crisis chapter, is when people experience trauma as children, it impedes the brain's ability to release serotonin. And serotonin is vital for the regulation of fear and anxiety. And when thinking about that situation, where on one hand you have gone through really serious challenges that very few others in the position that you now find yourself politically have ever been in. They haven't had to overcome these kind of obstacles. In what way is it, when thrown to the center of a media state like the United States, led by an undoubtedly racist billionaire who weaponizes your identity against you, already coming to a situation where structural racism against Muslims is so prevalent, the taking of civil liberties was a complete accepted status quo norm. It was seen as commonsensical in the society. And here you come along and problematize that. And you must have paid a massive price for your resistance. And so I just wanted to ask, how did that trauma, which I hope you're okay with me referring to it as trauma, on one hand, prepare you and help you? And then on the other hand, how may it have hindered you along this journey?
Yeah, that's a really deep question. I oftentimes describe myself as a survivor. And in order to be a survivor, you must have survived trauma. And so you are not far from the ways in which I see my childhood, and almost every single thing I've also gone through in my adult life as well. um, I think, in the earlier chapters in the book, I talk about this sense of being, even though I was part of a large family, I in a way felt like I was in it alone. And I had this responsibility to care for myself, to defend myself, to stand up for myself. And I think it sort of is like a metaphor, really truly, for what it means to be of a marginalized identity here in the United States. Because everyone else is bigger than you, everyone else is, their voices are louder than you, they have a bigger presence than you do. And so in my younger years, I would use the fear that I felt to directly um, expose myself of it by engaging in the creation of more fear.
Hmm.
And what I went through in my mid 20s was to realize that the the opposite of fear isn't bravery, it's actually courage.
Hmm.
Right? And we often think that when we are afraid, it's that like fight and flight. The people who fight, we think they're cowards.
Mhm.
The ones who fight, they're brave. And we don't often really understand that there is an actual opposite to that fear, which is to harness it, to understand what it does to you and where it's coming from, and how you want to utilize it to muster up the courage to confront it. And my midlife crisis was one, my early life crisis was one that sort of really brought all of those traumas to head for me. And I couldn't see myself as fleeing from it anymore, and I couldn't really directly fight it. I had to consume all of it
Hmm.
and internalize it and
Right.
really understand, right? What did the the life of being without a mother mean to me? What has, going through extreme tragedy of loss of home and identity at a young formative age meant for me?
mm,
And um, and I think, also understanding that, like, when you come so close multiple times, that young to death, it sort of makes you feel like you're invisible,
mm,
which in reality you're not, right? Just because you survived yesterday doesn't mean that you're going to survive today.
mm,
and and to me, there is a life today in existing in the United States where I deal with the trifecta of hate, right? The anti-immigrant sentiment, the anti-black sentiment, and the anti-Muslim sentiment. I'm also the embodiment, really, of everything that is hopeful and beautiful and encouraging about the United States diversity. And there is really a contradiction to how we idealize the presence of someone like myself, and how much of all of those other things show up for us, and we're like, oh no, she's a Muslim, no, she comes from the country where Black Hawk Down happened, oh no, she's an immigrant, and is, taking our places. And for me, as someone who sees as part of the family, I again am brought back, I think, to those earlier years where I feel like I am that small person who does see internally themselves as someone who is strong and big enough, and can take on the bullies. While today I don't engage in the physical aggression I used to engage in as a young kid, I now engage in um, a more robust and well-rounded defense of myself and my identities and my reasons for existing. And I realized that it's not even about me. It's truly about everything that I represent, right? When I was younger and I was fighting kids, I really never had kids directly attacking me. I was fighting because they were picking on a younger kid that I felt like didn't have the ability to fight for themselves, or the willingness to fight for themselves. And I think today we are living in a society where there is complacency, and there is just an acceptance that this is the norm, right? We think, we shouldn't, as Muslims, we shouldn't ask for the protection of our civil liberties. We shouldn't ask for our rightful place in society. We shouldn't ask for dignity and respect. Um, and the same thing as immigrants, we should just be grateful and not make any noise.
mm,
Well, you can do both, right? You can be grateful for this beautiful country that's giving you the opportunity to have the life that you want, but also challenge it, and that truly is the highest form of patriotism. And I also realized that in many ways there is no usage of a voice when it's influential if it's not fighting for those who can't use their voice to create influence.
I think the interesting thing about your story that I felt was it is a perfect example of what Chris Hedges calls the converting of personal pain into collective power, and a situation where through a trauma-induced hypervigilance, a person is able to assert a hybridity of US identity, which, in terms of the establishment in the United States, it's very much focused on an authentic core. But of course, as we know, that authentic and homogeneous core is actually a mythology. Eduardo Galeano put it this way. He said, it's very lucky that Christopher Columbus had a passport when he came. Otherwise, America would have never been discovered. And when you think about the role in the rest of the world that the United States has, military bases, especially with the expansion of AFRICOM in many places in Africa, you know, the principle applies that if the United States has a military base in somewhere like Djibouti, there is no reason that somebody who lives neighboring to that military base and probably is able to sustain themselves off of an economy which is linked to the presence of that military base, why would that person have no right to call themselves a US person or citizen? And I think Rafael Carrera put it this way in Ecuador during Obama's years. He said, if the United States has a military base in Ecuador, then I want a military base in the United States. It's a form of internationalism, which one way or another you are perceived to represent, which is about equality of voice and really piercing through the social injustice, which is so prevalent in the society that you live in. So, what I wanted to ask, why is it that you specifically are deemed so offensive to this pious hypocrisy of the United States today? What is it? What is it about you?
Well, few things. I think one, you just alluded to it, right? That there is the idea that my presence really is harnessing of that that sort of American idealism, which says, you know, I'm here and like I can do and be everything, and I am as American as everyone else. And it sort of, I think, points out the hypocrisy in which we have formed an identity of who an American is. And so the offense is that I can think of myself that way when I shouldn't
Mm,
really. Um, Even though we say America is a melting pot, uh, we don't want that to be actualized in some way, and that in itself really is a huge hypocrisy and a fallacy. And when you often think of everything you sort of really hate about yourself that you don't want anyone to notice, when anyone says something about it, you don't stop and think, oh, you're right, maybe I should change that, maybe I should you know internalize this criticism and figure out a
mm,
way to become a better person. You automatically go on the attack.
yeah.
You say, how dare you say that? I am not that person, this is not me. And I think that is truly the thing that is the most offensive to people about me. It's that they know that in America, even though, right, like this is what America looks like, the the idea that this is what America looks like is not one that they want. And that contradiction is upsetting
Yeah.
for some in this country. And so they lash out. Um, the idea that you would have someone who sort of embodies everything you hated about Obama, that wasn't true. You know, you said he was born in Kenya, he came from Africa. You said, you know, he was Muslim. So I mean, if you think about, you know, there was this sort of a real controversy with the presence of Obama, even though everybody knew that this was about hope and change. His presence itself was really an example of how much progress our country made. But then it brought about this controversy where so many people in this country really were offended by his presence. They said he's a foreigner, he's Muslim, he's contradictory to everything that is to be an American, which really never made sense, because to be an American is to be, right? We are a country of diverse people, of diverse religions, of diverse identities. And their fear is now culminated in this, in the existence of me in Congress. am I not only an immigrant, I actually come from Africa, right? And I am Muslim and visibly Muslim. And I have in their heads sort of an indoctrination that is not compatible with what it means to be an American. Even though I came here as a child, all of my teachings, all of my education, all of my upbringing has essentially happened in the United States in the same neighborhoods as them. And to me, it is that um, it's that is I think the most offensive and angering piece.
We are in a situation where, according to IMF figures, the United States is spending $750 billion dollars per year subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. You have globally $5 trillion being spent subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. All of that is due to increase massively with the situation we are currently in, where aviation companies are coming to the United States government and saying, we employ 700,000 people. It is your responsibility to ensure those people are able to get by, rather than those 700,000 people being employed doing something like testing. 96% of the population have not been tested. You could very easily give jobs to those 700,000 people. Simultaneous to that, you only have 0.2% of the federal budget going on the Environment Protection Agency. So we have a situation where you have a US military, which is a bigger polluter than 140 countries. It's, more is spent on the military in the United States than the 7 next biggest militaries put together. So the question that I wanted to ask was, Michelle Obama, when she came to this country, was asked about the experience of the Obama presidency. Now, she said the following: we mistakenly thought that Barack Obama was going to erase hundreds of years of history in 8 years. Now, if Michelle Obama doesn't see the potential for change within the US political system, why do you?
So I mean, that's a good question. I think it's really sad to hear it from First Lady Michelle Obama, former First Lady Michelle Obama, because it reminds us, I think, just how really slow change happens. We are set in our ways. And obviously, we live in a capitalist society where profits often are put before people, put before our climate, put before the interest of sustaining ourselves. And the idea that we would worry about what jobs are going to be lost without thinking about how jobs can be created in another for opportunities for jobs to be created in another industry really tells you how unserious people are about addressing the kind of climate crisis we're in, addressing the overloaded military budgets that we have. What I wanted, I think, in those Obama years, and what I still want, is for more people to have these honest conversations about the actual challenge that exists, where the opportunities are, and the urgency in which we need to address some of these issues that we have in our country and in the world. And I think oftentimes you get people stuck in thinking, I can't get my grand idea to work, so I am never going to talk about it because I want to keep the peace. So I'm just going to talk about what's doable. And I think for many of us, I see myself first as a legislator, as someone who addresses, the small problems that we have that can be fixed today in the form of committee work. We pass those through amendments, we negotiate, we push that forward. And when I use my influence as a legislator, I use it to advocate for comprehensive change, for progressive change, for us to really think outside of the box and push for bold ideas. And so I know that many of the things today that we are debating and voting on the House floor, like raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour or getting sensible gun laws, those issues 8 years ago, 7 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, people were laughed at for even thinking that those could be possible. I mean, I remember going to an early morning march with workers as the former labor member. I used to be with our local union, AFSME. And I remember going to this rally at 5 a.m. in the morning with then Congressman Keith Ellison, who's my predecessor and the first Muslim to serve in Congress. And being in front of McDonald's and advocating for a livable wage, for a dignified workplace, and asking for $15 an hour. Now, in Minneapolis, one of the most liberal cities in the country, people said that's not going to be possible. We're going to lose so many jobs. Small businesses are going to stop functioning if we pass this. And few years after I went to that rally, I got a job working at City Hall. We were able to get that done. $15 minimum wage passed in Minneapolis. And last year we passed it in Congress, in the House. Now it's sitting with Mitch McConnell. And I know once we have a Senate that cares about the people, we will pass that. And so today, when we talk about canceling student debt, or we talk about the Green New Deal, or we talk about, Medicare for all, I know that those things are going to be possible because we are talking about them. They're not magically going to appear because, if we don't talk about them. And I think that really was the problem for so many years, that it was talking about the things that can get done today without really starting a process that sort of gets people thinking about what's possible. And that's what we're doing today here in Congress.
So, in a sense, what you're saying is when advocating for a politics whereby the last come first, it's necessary to plant seeds for trees that we might not sit in the shade of. And on
Exactly.
that, yeah, and on that subject, I wanted to ask, it's well known that the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement was essential to moving the political culture in the world in regarding apartheid South Africa. Now, it was something that Palestinian civil society, off the basis of that success and off of the guidance of Desmond Tutu, found that when calling for the mere observance of international law, the respecting of UN resolutions, whether it was 192 or 242, they found that the call for BDS was a sound method of peaceful resistance. That's also not discounting the fact that UN resolutions have down that even armed resistance to foreign occupation is legitimate in international law, according to multiple UN resolutions. My question to you very quickly before we end would just be, there are those that say in this country, there are those that say in the United States that BDS is anti-Semitic. Do you disagree with that statement?
I do. I disagree with any kind of statement that says anything that is based on creating a peaceful movement that allows for people's rights to be accessed is inherently bigoted. And, anti-Semitism is a bigotry. And so the idea that somebody in search of their own liberation would be considered a bigot because they are using, you know, a nonviolent movement to advance their cause, really, I think, sits against everything we've been told. Every single movement that has brought about sustainable change, whether it is with South Africa or here in fighting Jim Crow laws, it's it's been, you know, to do the sit-ins, to have the boycotts, to advocate for you know, people to stand up and be on your side. And if we take that away from people, then what are we leaving them with? And for me, I believe in people's constitutional rights, to engage in forms of disobedience, in dissident, in asking for boycotts, in advocating for whatever it is that they feel like will allow them to have a voice at the table. Today in Minneapolis here, a Black man was killed by a police officer. Um, you know, watching the video, looking at this man laying on the ground as the police officer has his knee on his neck and him saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." This is a 10-minute video. The man ultimately dies, and the police officer still has his knee on his neck for another few minutes as this dead body lays on the ground. And, you know, for many years in Minneapolis, people have advocated for anti-protest, anti-speech policies because of the Black Lives Matter movement, because they didn't agree with their tactics, because they didn't believe these people should have a voice. And so I know that as a legislator, I have a duty to guarantee people the right to ask for their humanity to be protected, for their dignity to be protected, and for anyone to not feel like if they don't speak up, they're no longer going to be alive. And for me, it stems from that child who, you know, couldn't watch a little kid get bullied. And like, I refuse to allow for anyone to be bullied, especially when we have a great constitution that creates a protection for people to be able to be themselves and advocate for the things they care about.
And it's not a question, it's just one last point I'd love to make. I know that we've already gone over time. Thank you for your time. The 1929 crash and the Great Depression that followed it is comparable to the situation we are currently in. Now, there are those who claim that the way that the United States, along with Roosevelt's New Deal, was able to find a way out of it was through war, because it created a huge amount of jobs. It created people that needed to build machinery, people that needed to join the army, people that need to stitch the uniforms. One of the fears that some may have is that Donald Trump, presiding over a collapsed economy, and as I said before, possibly the greatest public health failure in US history, may look to pursue war of some kind. We do know that the United States has hot and cold wars around the world anyway, but we, those of us in the anti-war movement around the world, believe that we can have faith in you and your steadfast stand that you take with the wretched of the earth around the world. I appreciate your presence. I'm glad you exist in the
Let
world.
me just say quickly to you, I think it's also good for us to have faith in the fact that there are a lot of people like you and I. There are many people who are sensible in Congress. Of course, we have a president who's not sensible, so those things are possible from him. But we ultimately, I believe, will harness our voices and stop any kind of madness that would lead to war, because we do have an alternative. That alternative is to invest in mass infrastructure. And once we do that, that in itself creates an opportunity for people to have jobs. You know, I have legislation that asks for a federal jobs guarantee, which puts people to work in our communities. And so we just have to think creatively, and oftentimes we can think about, what is bad, and we can debate about all the horrible things. We don't spend a lot of energy in debating about all the good things that can happen and should happen. And I hope that as the conversation happens about the possibility of war being a way to stimulate the economy, which just sounds ridiculous, I hope people spend time in talking about the possibility of investing in infrastructure, and creating jobs. Things like canceling student debts stimulates the economy. There are positive solutions that we need to debate and offer as a solution, and not just talk about only the things that could go wrong.
I'm with you. I'm with
The
you.
optimist in the room always. So.
That's good. It's good. But thank you so much for this. I've really enjoyed it and benefited from it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for reading the book.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I've recommended it to one or two other people, but yeah, it's good stuff. It's good stuff. Important.
Great.
So it was great today to have that conversation with US Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. And also, I'm thankful for the opportunity to discover and get into her book, This Is What America Looks Like. It's definitely a good read for all people that consider themselves part of diasporas rooted in the global South. Till next time, this is Lowkey.